Before I take you back to the night I ended my father's reputation in a ballroom full of people who called him honorable, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop your city and local time in the comments. I always want to know where these stories are being heard. My name is Eleanor Hart. I'm 41 years old. And until 11 weeks ago, I thought the worst thing my father had ever done was love control more than he loved people. I was wrong. The worst thing he ever did was steal from my mother while she was still alive, then teach the rest of us to call it protection. And the night I proved it, I didn't just ruin his retirement gala. I rewrote the story my family had been living inside for 23 years. Before I tell you about that night, I need to take you back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon in April, when I found a key taped inside the hem of one of my dead mother's winter coats. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for a scarf. That's the part people always miss. They think life-changing truths arrive with thunder, with dramatic music, with some instinct that tells you history is about to split open. But most of the time, the truth shows up while you're doing something ordinary. I was in my mother's old closet. My mother, Margaret Hart, had been dead for 9 months. Official cause was a stroke. Unofficial cause, if you ask me now, was 20 years of swallowing words that should have been spoken out loud. My mother was one of those women who could keep a house so calm that people mistook it for peace. Fresh flowers on the kitchen counter, linen napkins on ordinary Sundays, birthday cards mailed exactly on time, every thank you note handwritten in blue ink. She believed in dignity. She believed in restraint. She believed the worst thing you could do in public was make other people uncomfortable. My father built his whole life around women like that. Charles Hart was 72, a retired estate attorney, chairman of 2 nonprofit boards, regular guest speaker at charity luncheons, the kind of man who could put a hand on your shoulder and make you feel blessed or corrected depending on how hard his fingers pressed. People loved him, men admired him, women trusted him. He had spent 40 years becoming the sort of person nobody thinks to question. He wore kindness like a tailored suit, perfect fit, very expensive, hard to see the seams. I'm the older daughter. Rebecca is my younger sister by 5 years. She teaches art history at a private school in Westport, lives in a white colonial with climbing roses, and has always moved through life like she expected the world to soften when she entered it. My father adored that about her. She called it closeness. I called it obedience with good lighting. I was the difficult one, not dramatic, not reckless, just inconveniently observant. I'm a forensic accountant. Numbers don't intimidate me. Silence doesn't comfort me. And once I notice a pattern, I can't unsee it. Families like mine don't usually know what to do with daughters like that, so they give you labels. Serious, cold, intense. The labels are meant to do one thing, make your clarity sound like a personality flaw. By the time my mother died, I was living in Hartford with my husband Daniel and our son Oliver, who was 11 and at that age where every question starts with why and ends with another why. We'd been driving down to my parents' house every other weekend to help sort through things. My father called it practical housekeeping. Rebecca called it making progress. I called it what it was, controlled erasure. Every week there was less of my mother left in that house. The scarves went first, then the framed recipes in the kitchen, then the chair in the bedroom corner where she used to sit and read with a blanket over her knees. 9 months after the funeral, you could stand in that house and still smell her perfume if you knew where to breathe, but you had to look for evidence of her. My father had already started talking about the next chapter. He said it with the smile men use when they're trying to make reinvention sound noble. That Tuesday, rain tapped against the windows while I stood in her closet sorting coats into donation bags. Cashmere, wool, camel trench, navy peacoat, then a heavy green winter coat, old and plain and very much not my mother's usual taste. When I lifted it, something in the lining shifted. I ran my fingers along the hem. There was a bump, stitched in unevenly. I found small sewing scissors in her vanity drawer and opened the seam. Out fell a brass key and a folded strip of paper. On the paper, in my mother's handwriting, were 6 words. If Charles is still lying, open 214. I read it twice. Then I sat down on the floor of her closet with the coat in my lap and felt the first clean crack in the story I had been told about my mother's life. Because my mother did not write notes like that casually. She left instructions for casserole timing, for Christmas china, for how much salt went in the shortbread. She did not leave coded messages unless she believed one day someone would need them. I slipped the key and note into my bag. Downstairs, my father was in the study on a donor call. I could hear his low-polished voice through the half-closed door. Rebecca was in the kitchen rinsing teacups. "Find anything worth keeping?" she asked without looking up. I watched her for a second too long. She turned, drying her hands. "What?" "Nothing," I said. "Just old coats." Her shoulders loosened by 1/2 inch. If you've ever realized someone is afraid of what you might know, You know the feeling. It isn't proof. It's worse. It's direction. That night, after Oliver was asleep, I showed Daniel the key. He turned it over in his palm. A safety deposit box? Probably. And you think your father knows? I think my mother hoped he didn't. Daniel didn't ask whether I was overreacting. He never did that to me. That's one of the reasons I married him. He looked at the note again and said, "Then open 214. The next morning, I took the note to every bank branch within 10 miles of my parents' town until one of them recognized the box format and confirmed my mother had held a private safety deposit box there for 14 years. Box 214. The manager, a woman with silver glasses and the kind of professional expression people use when they know they're about to witness something personal, verified my identity and brought me into the vault. The box was narrow and surprisingly heavy. Inside were 3 things: a leather document pouch, a flash drive, and a sealed letter with my name written across the front in the same blue ink my mother used on birthday cards. I didn't open the letter in the bank. I carried the pouch and the drive to my car, locked the doors, and sat with both hands on the steering wheel while rain streaked down the windshield. Then I opened the letter. The first line was this: "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I ran out of time or courage. Possibly both." I stopped there. My mother had never written to me in that tone before, not as a mother explaining something, as a witness. The letter was 6 pages long. She wrote that my maternal grandfather had created a trust in 2001 holding 2 assets, the lake house in Rhode Island and a portfolio of commercial properties in New Haven. The trust was meant to remain under her control and after her death pass equally to Rebecca and me. I knew the lake house. I knew the name of the trust in the abstract. What I had not known, what apparently no one had bothered to tell me, was that the trust no longer existed in its original form. According to my mother, 8 months after my grandfather died, my father told her the trust needed temporary restructuring for tax efficiency. He brought paperwork home. He said it was administrative. He said he would handle it. He said if they didn't move quickly, the properties could be tied up in probate complications for years. My mother signed. The assets were moved, not into a revised family trust, into a holding company, controlled by my father, with Rebecca listed as successor director. Not me, not both daughters. Rebecca. My vision blurred for a second. I kept reading. My mother wrote that she discovered the truth 2 years later when she asked why income statements from the commercial properties had stopped arriving. My father told her the properties were underperforming and that she was getting confused. When she pushed, he became cold, then angry, then generous, then wounded. He cycled through tones the way some people change ties. She wrote, "Charles has a gift. He can turn your injury into his burden within 5 minutes." I put the letter down and looked at the rain on the windshield. Then I picked it up again. There was more. My mother had started collecting records quietly. She copied wire transfers, annual statements, corporate filings, emails. She suspected that over time, income from the properties had been used to fund my father's foundation work, Rebecca's down payment, and certain expenses Charles called family stewardship. Then I reached the sentence that changed Rebecca from possibility to certainty. I told Rebecca in 2017. She cried and asked me not to force a confrontation. She said the family would split. I told her the family was already split. Only the truth had not caught up yet. I read that line 3 times. Rebecca knew. My sister knew. And then, near the end, the sentence that split me open. The night you were 16 and heard me drop the crystal bowl in the dining room, Charles had just told me that if I challenged him publicly, he would make me sound unstable, medicated, and forgetful. The next morning he sent flowers to the house. You told me they were beautiful. I smiled because I did not know how to explain fear to my own daughter. I remembered that night instantly. The sound of breaking glass. The silence after. My father in the hallway telling me, "Your mother is tired. Go upstairs." The next day, white roses in a crystal vase. My mother smiling too carefully at breakfast. Some memories don't become clear. They become guilty. I went home and plugged in the flash drive. There were scanned bank statements, trust records, correspondence, 1 audio file, and a folder labeled, "If he denies it." Inside that folder was a signed memorandum in my father's handwriting, dated June 12, 2003. It stated that the transfer of trust assets into Hart Strategic Holdings was provisional, and that the beneficial interest of Margaret Hart remains acknowledged pending later restoration. It was not a confession in the cinematic sense. It was something better, a controlled man making the mistake of writing down the lie he intended to outlive. I called no one that night except one person, Laura Finch. She was a litigation attorney in Hartford and an old college friend of mine, ruthless in the best way, Clear, efficient, allergic to sentimental manipulation. I sent her 3 files and wrote, "Need eyes, urgent, private." She replied 13 minutes later, "Come tomorrow. Don't discuss with family yet." At 9 a.m. the next morning, I sat in her office while she reviewed everything. She finished the letter, took off her glasses, and said, "This is bad." "How bad?" "Civilly, very bad for him. Potentially recoverable asset diversion, breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent inducement, concealment. Depending on statute and structure, some claims are easier than others, but this is not nothing." "And Rebecca?" Laura looked at me for a second before answering. "If your mother's account is right, your sister had knowledge. Whether that rises to legal exposure depends on what she signed and when, but morally, she's already in it." I stared at the conference table. Laura tapped the memorandum. "This matters. So do the bank trails. If we pull corporate records and transaction history, we can build the architecture. Right now you have enough to know the story is real. Soon you may have enough to force consequences." I asked the question I had been avoiding since the bank vault. "What if I don't want only legal consequences?" Laura didn't smile. "Then be honest with yourself. Do you want money back, or do you want the narrative back?" I thought of my mother, quiet in a house built around my father's reputation. "Both," I said. She nodded once. "Then do not move too early." For 10 days, I said nothing. I gathered registry filings, corporate records, tax attachments, payment schedules from the New Haven properties, a full transfer history on the Rhode Island lake house, which I had believed was still held in family trust and had in fact been quietly retitled 12 years earlier through a shell structure that traced back to my father. Every document made the same point in a different dialect. He had taken what was not his and then built language around the taking until it sounded like management. Daniel watched me move through the house at night with legal pads and printouts spread across the dining room table. "How are you holding up?" he asked one evening. I gave him the honest answer. "I'm angry in a very organized way." "That tends to be your most dangerous form." I almost laughed. Then I played him the audio file. It was my mother's voice, very soft, as if she were recording after midnight. "If Eleanor ever hears this," she said, "I need her to know that I was not confused. I was not weak. I was cornered. There is a difference." Then a pause. "Rebecca knows more than she has admitted. Charles believes silence is proof of loyalty. It is not. It is proof of fear." When the recording ended, Daniel said nothing for a long time. Then, "What's the next family event?" I looked up. "My father's retirement gala." He knew immediately. "When?" 3 weeks. "For the foundation?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair. 200 people telling him how generous he is? Closer to 300. "And there's a program?" "There's always a program." That was the first moment the shape of what I would do became visible. Not impulsive, not theatrical, structural. My father's retirement gala had been planned for months. Black tie optional. Waterfront hotel in New Haven, donors, board members, former clients, city officials, church friends, family. A celebration of Charles Hart's decades of public service, mentorship, stewardship, all the words powerful men collect when they want to become untouchable. 2 weeks before the event, Rebecca called. Her voice was bright in that brittle way people sound when they are trying to stand on a floor they know is cracking. "Dad wants to know if you'll say a few words at the gala." There it was. "About what?" I asked. "Oh, you know, Mom, family, his legacy." Legacy. The nerve of that word nearly made me admire him. I said yes. Rebecca exhaled in relief too quickly. "You'll keep it warm, right?" she asked. Warm. Families have 1,000 words for dishonest. Warm is one of them. 3 days later, my father emailed me bullet points for my remarks. I read them standing in my kitchen while Daniel loaded the dishwasher. He had outlined the entire emotional arc he wanted from me: gratitude for my upbringing, admiration for his sacrifices, a line about how my mother had trusted Charles with everything because she knew his love made this family possible. The final suggested sentence was, "Thank you, Dad, for protecting what mattered most." I stared at that line until it blurred. Daniel dried his hands and read over my shoulder. "Well," he said quietly, "that aged badly." That same night, I called Rebecca. "Did you know he sent me bullet points?" I asked. She hesitated. "He just wants the night to go smoothly." "I'm going to ask you something once. Did you know about the trust?" Silence. Not confusion. Not offense. Silence. "I need to hear you say it," I said. Rebecca's breath caught. "Eleanor." "Did you know?" "Yes." One word. There it was. She started crying immediately after, as if tears could travel backward and rewrite a fact. He told me it was temporary. He said Mom was making it bigger than it was. Then later he said if we pushed, there could be tax issues, legal issues, public embarrassment. He said he was holding everything together. And you believed him? I believed that if I challenged him, he would destroy the family. I leaned against the counter and looked out into the dark backyard. He already did, I said. She whispered, please don't humiliate him at the gala. That word. Humiliate. As if public truth were cruelty, but private theft were merely complicated. I'm not humiliating him, I said. I'm ending the edit. She cried harder. I hung up. A week before the gala, an unexpected ally arrived. My Aunt Judith, my mother's older sister, flew in from Chicago and asked me to meet her for coffee. Aunt Judith had never liked my father, though for most of my life, she hid it behind good manners and deliberate distance. At the cafe, she placed a manila envelope on the table between us. Your mother mailed this to me in 2019, she said, told me not to open it unless something happened to her before she fixed things. Inside were photocopies of the same memorandum I had found, plus one more document I had not seen. A draft letter, unsigned, written by my mother to my father. It said, you may be able to control the legal form of what you did, Charles, but not the moral fact. You took what my father left for me and our daughters and converted it into an instrument of your own power. Then you asked us to call that love. I looked up at Judith. Why didn't you show me this sooner? She held my gaze without blinking. Because your mother asked me to wait until I was certain you were ready to stop forgiving him for things he never apologized for. Some sentences don't comfort you. They identify you. The day of the gala arrived cold and clear. Blue water beyond the hotel windows, white tablecloths, brass light fixtures. A string quartet in the reception hall playing music expensive people describe as tasteful. On the stage hung a huge screen with a slideshow rotating through images from my father's life. Law school graduation, foundation dinners, ribbon cuttings, family Christmases, my parents at black tie events, my mother smiling beside him like grace itself had taken human form and married ambition. The event program listed 6:30 cocktail reception, 7 to 1:15 welcome remarks, 7:30 tribute video, 7:45 board recognition, 8 guy, reflections from family, Rebecca Hartbell, Eleanor Hart Lawson, 8:20, response from Charles Hart. My name was printed in gold script. Daniel came with me. He wore a navy suit and the expression he gets when he knows someone is about to confuse calm with weakness. My father was near the entrance greeting guests. He looked immaculate. Black tuxedo, silver cufflinks, posture straight, smile easy. When he saw me, his face arranged itself into paternal warmth. There she is, he said, kissing my cheek. My serious girl. I almost flinched. That line had followed me for 30 years. Affection with a narrowing edge. A way of saying capable, difficult, mine. You look beautiful, he said. Thank you for doing this. For doing this. As if the evening had already been decided. Rebecca stood nearby in a slate blue gown, pale and overcomposed. Her husband Matthew kept one hand at the small of her back like he was holding together something unstable. When she hugged me, she whispered, "Please." I stepped back. No one begged Mom in time either, I said. At 7:30, the tribute video began. 10 minutes of soft piano and public sainthood. Photos of my father mentoring young attorneys, accepting awards, serving meals at shelters, standing beside my mother on charity gala red carpets, then family footage, summers at the lake house, Christmas mornings, my father teaching Rebecca to ride a bicycle, my father holding me as a child in front of the stone fireplace in the Rhode Island house that, according to every story I had ever been told, he had kept alive for us all. Kept alive. I sat there in the dark ballroom and watched stolen property become sentimental backdrop. A title card appeared on the screen. A life built on service. I heard someone at the next table sniffle into a napkin. My mother, if she had lived to see that phrase projected 30 feet high, would have laughed once, quietly. The kind of laugh that means something inside you has gone past pain and reached clarity. The lights came up. Board members gave speeches. Former clients praised his wisdom. A pastor thanked him for decades of integrity in both public and private life. Then the MC smiled toward our table. And now, reflections from family. First, Charles's younger daughter, Rebecca. Rebecca walked to the podium with careful shoulders and hands clasped too tightly around her note cards. She spoke for 4 minutes. About childhood summers, about discipline, about values, about how our father had taught her that stewardship meant carrying what others could not. Halfway through, her voice shook. She almost looked at me. She didn't. Then the MC said, "And now, Eleanor Hart Lawson." I stood. 300 people turned. The walk to the podium felt very long and very quiet. Not because the room was silent, but because I could hear every detail separately. The clink of a fork against china, someone shifting in a chair, the hum of the projector, the soft vibration of my own pulse at the base of my throat. I set my pages on the podium. I looked out at the room. My father was smiling, confident, expectant, the smile of a man who thinks even his risks have been curated. I adjusted the microphone. "Good evening," I said. "My name is Eleanor Hart Lawson, and tonight I was asked to speak about my father's legacy." A polite murmur of attention. I was also sent suggested talking points. Scattered laughter. My father's smile held, but only just. I was told to speak about protection, stewardship, family trust. I let the last 2 words sit in the air, which is why I can't give the speech I was expected to give. The room changed, not loudly, structurally. You can feel it when an audience stops leaning back and starts leaning in. I took out my mother's letter. 9 months after my mother died, I found a note hidden in the lining of one of her coats. It led me to a safety deposit box. Inside that box was a letter from my mother, financial records, and documents concerning the transfer of assets that belonged to her family trust. At the front table, my father stopped moving entirely. Rebecca went white. I continued. "For most of my life, I believed the Rhode Island Lake House and several commercial properties in New Haven were preserved by my father out of devotion to our family. That is not what happened." Now the room was completely still. In 2003, those assets were moved out of my mother's control under the claim of temporary restructuring. They were transferred into a holding company controlled by my father. My mother later learned that income from those assets had been redirected for years without her informed consent. My father stood up. "Eleanor," he said sharply, "not here." I looked directly at him. "You had 23 years to decide where," I said. "You chose nowhere." A sound moved through the room, not speech, shock taking shape. He took 1 step toward the stage. Daniel stood up from our table. He didn't say anything, he didn't threaten. He simply stood in the aisle and met my father's eyes. My father stopped. Some people in that room had never seen another man say no to Charles Hart without speaking. I unfolded the memorandum. "This is a document in my father's handwriting," I said, dated June 12, 2003. It states that the transfer of trust assets was provisional and acknowledges that beneficial interest remained with my mother, Margaret Hart, pending later restoration. I read the relevant lines aloud. No one interrupted. I looked back at my father. "Did you restore them?" He said nothing. "Did you tell your daughters the truth?" Nothing. "Did you let Mom keep believing she was confused whenever she asked where her own family assets had gone?" At a nearby table, one of the foundation trustees slowly set down his water glass. I held up my mother's letter. "She wrote this to me before she died. I'm going to read 1 paragraph." My father's voice came harder now. "This is grotesque." I didn't stop. "Charles has a gift," I read. "He can turn your injury into his burden within 5 minutes. If Eleanor ever learns what happened, I want her to know that I was not confused. I was not weak. I was cornered." The room broke, not in volume, but in alignment. People were no longer attending a gala. They were witnessing a correction. My Aunt Judith stood up from her table and said clearly, "I have copies." It was one of the most beautiful moments of my life, not because it was dramatic, because it ended the possibility that anyone could call me emotional and make that explanation stick. I continued. "My sister knew years ago. My mother told her. She was afraid. I understand fear. My mother lived with it for decades. But fear does not become innocence just because it cries." Rebecca put both hands over her mouth. I looked at her, then back at the crowd. "This is not a speech about a complicated family misunderstanding. This is a statement about theft disguised as stewardship, about control disguised as protection, about a woman whose silence was used against her by the man everyone in this room has spent years calling honorable." A man at the back, one of my father's longtime board colleagues, said quietly, "Charles, is any of this untrue?" My father turned toward the sound, and for the first time in my life, I saw him without an immediate answer. Not because he had become humble, because he had run out of framing. Finally he said, "Everything I ever did was for this family." There it was, the old magic trick. Intent over impact, narrative over fact, love as retroactive permission. I answered him the way I had rehearsed in my own head 100 times. "No," I said, "everything you did was to remain the author." A woman near the center table started crying. 3 people quietly stood and left. then 5 more, not in anger, in disillusionment. That was the part I will never forget. The softness of departure, the sound of chairs moving back as reputation drained from a room. I reached for the final page in my folder. "There is one more thing," I said. My father often described the lake house as the place where our family became itself, but what he never said was that it was my mother's inheritance. My grandfather left it to her, not him. The house where we spent every summer was not preserved by my father's generosity. It was preserved by my mother's silence. The line landed harder than I expected, because everyone in that ballroom understood what inheritance meant. Not just money, origin, intention, bloodline, the moral map of who was meant to receive what. My father sat down slowly. He looked older than he had an hour earlier, not frail, just reduced, as if a layer of force had peeled off him and revealed how much of his body had been posture all along. The MC looked lost. The board chair whispered urgently to someone. The quartet in the reception hall, unaware of timing, had started playing again outside the ballroom doors. Faint cello under ruin. I ended simply. My mother deserved better than private suffering and public revision. So this is me correcting the record. Her name was Margaret Hart. She knew what was done to her. She objected to it. And beginning Monday, her estate will formally seek recovery. No applause. Truth like that should not be applauded. It should be absorbed. I stepped away from the podium. Rebecca was crying openly now, but she did not come to me. My father did not move. Judith crossed the room and took my hand. Daniel met me at the foot of the stage. "Ready?" he asked. I looked once more at the giant screen still glowing behind the podium. A life built on service. I almost smiled. Then we left. The next morning, everything changed fast. Board members resigned from statements they had made the night before. The foundation issued a vague notice about postponed internal review. My father called 6 times before noon. I did not answer. Rebecca texted, "I'm sorry, I should have spoken sooner." I didn't know how. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I wrote back, "I know." That was part of the damage. On Monday, Laura filed. The petition was precise, unemotional, devastating. Asset diversion, beneficial ownership claims, breach of fiduciary duty, constructive fraud, request for accounting, request for injunctive relief against further liquidation. 3 days later, Laura called with an update. "You're not alone," she said. "What do you mean?" "After the gala, 2 former clients of your father reached out. Both say they had family trust disputes where Charles positioned himself as advisor and ended up with broader control than they understood at the time. It may not go anywhere yet, but your story shook loose other stories." I sat down at my desk. The thing about powerful men is this. Once one version breaks, people start testing the glass on the others. A week later, my father finally reached me by calling from an unknown number. His voice sounded thinner. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About ending this." That phrasing told me everything. Not fixing, not admitting, ending. We met at a hotel lounge halfway between Hartford and New Haven. He was already there when I arrived. Gray suit, no tie, black coffee untouched. For a moment he looked less like my father than like one of the older clients I used to see waiting outside conference rooms, men startled by the idea that paperwork could outlive charm. "I made mistakes," he said. Not I lied, not I took. Mistakes. The cowards plural. I sat down and let him keep talking. "I was trying to stabilize things after your grandfather died. Your mother was overwhelmed. The trust structure was inefficient. I did what I thought was necessary. You used her fear of legal complexity to move her inheritance into your control." His jaw tightened. "That is a hostile reading. It's the accurate one." He looked at me for a long time. "What do you want, Eleanor?" There it was again, as if justice were a preference set. "I want you to stop dressing appetite as duty." For the first time, something in his face moved without permission, not guilt, hurt pride. "I gave this family everything." "No," I said. "You gave this family a story in which everything belonged to you." He looked down at his cup. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower, less polished. "Your mother could be passive to the point of danger." I leaned back. "She had to become passive," I said, "because every time she told the truth, you punished the atmosphere." He flinched. Tiny. Real. It was the first uncontrolled reaction I had ever seen from him. And that, more than anger, told me I had finally reached the part of him untouched by performance. 2 weeks later, Rebecca called and asked to see me. We met in my kitchen after Oliver had gone to a friend's house. She looked wrecked. No makeup. Hair scraped back. Fingers twisted around a tea mug she never lifted. "I signed things," she said before sitting down. "I need to tell you exactly what I signed." She described board resolutions, tax documents, successor paperwork, all presented as technical necessity. At first she believed him. Later she understood enough to suspect. Then Mom told her outright. Rebecca asked why our mother didn't just leave him. I asked that carefully, because sometimes people reveal themselves most when they try to explain another person's limits. Rebecca started crying again. Because leaving him would have meant a public war she didn't think she could win. Because he knew everyone. Because he would have made her sound unstable. Because by then she had spent 20 years being told that conflict itself was a kind of failure. I said nothing. Rebecca looked at me. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." "Good," I said, "because I'm not there." That was the first honest conversation we had ever had. Not healing. Not resolution. Just truth, without decoration. Sometimes that is the beginning. The legal case moved faster than I expected. The memorandum mattered. The bank trails mattered. But the thing that truly changed the negotiation posture was an independent forensic review showing that income from the trust origin assets had been used in part to collateralize loans benefiting entities tied exclusively to my father. Once the numbers started speaking, the morality became harder to bury. Mediation was scheduled. My father's attorneys proposed partial settlement language that preserved dignity and avoided admissions. Laura read it, snorted once, and slid it across the table to me. "They want to pay without describing." "What do we want?" she asked. I thought about my mother's note in the coat lining, "If Charles is still lying, open 214. "I want the record corrected," I said, so we countered. Restoration of beneficial ownership to my mother's estate. Formal accounting of diverted income. Rebecca's voluntary withdrawal from successor control. And one sentence I refused to surrender. Margaret Hart was not informed in any full or fair way regarding the permanent transfer of trust origin assets, and later objected to their continued control outside her ownership. My father fought that line longer than he fought the money. Of course he did. Because money can be paid. Language remains. In the end, he signed. When Laura called to tell me, I was standing in the grocery store cereal aisle. For one absurd second, I just stared at boxes of granola while she explained the terms. "It's done," she said. I closed my eyes. Relief didn't feel like triumph. It felt like air returning to a room that had been sealed too long. That afternoon, I drove alone to the cemetery. My mother's headstone was simple. Margaret Ann Hart, beloved mother, sister, friend, not wife. I used to think that omission was poetic. Now I think it was merciful. I sat on the damp grass and read the settlement language out loud. No thunder, no sign, no cinematic wind, just corrected record. Sometimes justice isn't a verdict. It's a sentence finally written in the right order. 3 months after the gala, the foundation announced my father's immediate retirement from all advisory roles. Publicly, it was for personal reasons. Privately, donors had begun asking better questions. 2 board members resigned. One local paper ran a careful, restrained piece about asset dispute allegations involving a prominent retired attorney. It never became national. I never wanted that. This was never about spectacle. It was about ending the private immunity of a man who had mistaken silence for consent. Rebecca started therapy. That sounds like the kind of update people put in stories to make them tidier than they are. Life isn't tidy. Therapy didn't make her brave retroactively. It just meant she had stopped pretending fear was wisdom. Some damage cannot be reversed, but it can at least be named. As for my father, he moved out of the New Haven house 6 months later. Not because the law forced him to, because he could no longer live inside a place where too many objects had become witnesses. The lake house in Rhode Island remains in the family now through a restored structure that names my mother properly in its history. That matters to me more than I can explain, not because of the property, because origin was returned. Last month I took Oliver there for a weekend. He stood on the dock at sunset skipping stones and asked, "Mom, did Grandma like it here?" I looked at the water, the same water that had held our family's summers, while the truth underneath them shifted unseen. "Yes," I said. It was hers. He nodded like that made complete sense. Children understand belonging more naturally than adults do. Adults complicate ownership until morality starts sounding negotiable. There's one last thing. A week after the settlement, I received a letter from my father. Handwritten. No legal language, no formal tone, no apology worthy of the word. He wrote, "I still believe I did what was necessary, but I see now that necessity was too often whatever allowed me to remain in command. I read that line 3 times. It was not redemption, but it was the closest he had ever come to truth without disguising it as management. I put the letter in a folder with my mother's note, her 6-page letter, the memorandum, and the settlement copy. 4 documents. 4 different versions of power, fear, control, witness, correction. If you ask me now whether exposing him was revenge, I'll tell you this. Revenge would have been making him suffer the way my mother suffered. I didn't do that. I did something colder and cleaner. I took away his ability to keep calling the theft love. And if you've ever grown up in a family where the most dangerous person was the one everyone else called generous, then you know exactly how much that matters. My name is Eleanor Hart Lawson. My mother's name was Margaret Hart. The house by the water was hers, the trust was hers, the truth was hers, and in the end, so was the record. If you had to choose between protecting your family's image and telling the truth about what it cost someone to maintain it, what would you choose? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and if this story stayed with you, subscribe. Because the next one is about the son who found a second funeral program in his grandfather's desk. One printed for a burial that never happened. Trust me, you don't want to miss that one.